Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Welcome to today's Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is Wednesday. Today is the 27th day of January in the year 2016. It's hard to believe that we will end the month of January this week. And when we get back, excuse me, and when we get back together again next week, next Monday, we will be into the first day of February. It's unbelievable how rapidly the month of January has gone. I'm a little bit surprised and a little bit anxious about the long-term weather forecast here in the mountains for us. I'm looking at projections of temperatures in the mid-50s the first of next week. So we may be about to revisit some of our delightful fall weather that preceded this snowstorm we had, and of course the melt. We've had some rain yesterday and some overcast but warmer temperatures yesterday as well, and we've had quite a bit of melt, and most of the substantive amounts of the snow that we had over the weekend are pretty much gone. It is a pleasure to be with you today on this Wednesday. I do apologize for not doing a program yesterday. I chatted with Bob, and we made the decision not to. I don't want to get into any details now because I don't want to start something and then not have the time to finish it. So, if it's okay with you, I'd like to postpone discussion, consideration of a couple of things with you until next week when we come back live here at the Virtual Center. There are two issues or projects, if you will, that I've been working on over the last intensively over the last 4 or 5 days. One of them I've been working on for a lot longer than that, but that was part of the reason. I've been having a number of meetings with a few former colleagues that I taught with here in West Virginia at Concord University, and we have a project that we have pretty much put together, and we had one final session this morning on that, and we basically, I think, polished it up to the point that it's ready to go. So I'd like to give it a couple of days, and then maybe when we get together next week, possibly, in fact, presumably next Monday, the first of the week, I'd like to share with you a couple of things that I'm in. One's only going to take a moment to just let you know. The other is going to take a little bit longer. So, but that's the reason that we decided not to have. I was so enmeshed in this yesterday morning that we literally got right up almost to program time, and I didn't have the time. I didn't really feel that I was adequately prepared to do the program, and I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't get on the air and embarrass myself or embarrass Bob Kincaid, the head on radio network, or anyone else. So I called Bob and requested that we suspend our live program yesterday. As you know, I attend a Rotary meeting just prior to the Tuesday programs, which is the reason that we usually begin at 1:30 Eastern time rather than 1. In other words, we cut our program by 30 minutes on Tuesdays. And yesterday I was looking at a situation which was going to require that we cut it more than that for a couple of reasons. One was community focused, and the other one was a little bit more political focused. But anyway, I'll share some of that with you when we get together next week. What I would like to do first is welcome you to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I indicated when we were together on Monday that our program yesterday, and of course theoretically would be pick up today, would get back into the issues associated with the emergence of America's two-party system, more specifically beginning with Washington's farewell address. You'll recall that in our last program last week, which is just a week ago today, we began to look at Washington's farewell address, and we were kind of setting the stage, if you will, for Washington's concern and considerations about the emergence of political parties in the nation during the 1790s, during his administration. And of course, the two names associated with that particular political reality were Alexander Hamilton, who was pretty much the driving force behind the Federalist the Federalist Party during this period, and Thomas Jefferson, who was leading, whose name was associated with the leadership of the opposition as it developed. In actual fact, of course, it's probably accurate to say that the real political operator in the development of the Jeffersonian opposition to federalism, to the Hamilton system, was more James Madison in the House of Representatives than it was Thomas Jefferson. In the House of Representatives, we had not only Madison working to organize the opposition, but also the representative from Western Virginia, which is now West Virginia, where I'm speaking, John Beckley, and Alfred Beckley, and Beckley was the secretary for the House of Representatives and very, very active in the organization of the emerging opposition to federalism, which ultimately emerged as Jeffersonianism, or as the textbooks refer to it, Jeffersonian Republicanism. We pretty much got to that point last Wednesday, and then we postponed consideration of Washington's farewell address to this week. I'd like your permission to request yet another postponement, and I'd like to put the two-party system and Washington's farewell address off until next week. I mentioned just a moment ago that I had a couple of things I wanted to talk to you about when we got together next Monday, and I still want to do that. But I don't think that would take the entire 2-hour program. So my guess is that by the time we get into our second hour on Monday, we'll be prepared and able to resume our discussion or conversation about Washington's farewell address as it affects the emergence of two-party politics in America. What I really want to do, of course, is lay the groundwork for the evolution or the transition of our party system into what we have today, which is a very, very unique political party system amongst the democracies or republics of the world. That didn't just happen. It didn't come from the pen of any of our leaders. It happened as much from the necessity to confront or address political realities of the time. But the fact of the matter is, our political system in the early years of the nation under the Constitution began to undergo a very, very significant transition. And I'd like to spend some time getting to explaining as best I can and tracing the evolution of that transition, because I think it is a particularly important one. Why am I requesting permission to postpone the two-party system for yet another day? Bob Kincaid, and I know on his program last night, he's been talking quite a bit on his program about the issue of an Article 5 convention. And yesterday, when Bob and I were talking about canceling yesterday's program, Bob suggested that it really might be helpful if we revisited the issue of the idea of the Article 5 convention. The convention theoretically being called to amend the Constitution of the United States. So it is with that in mind that I'd like to really revisit that today, and I don't know. I hope I can contribute to it. I know that Bob's there, and he probably will join us in some of this conversation, because I think this is particularly pertinent given some of the things that have been happening, not only in Washington, but even in a little rural wildlife refuge several hours, 4 or 5 hours drive from Portland, Oregon, as you know. The Constitution is constantly in the media. It's constantly being discussed, and I think it is in many ways as relevant to today's political life and reality for us as it's ever been. So with this, I'd like to get into some of these issues, and again, I want to avail you or make you aware of the fact that we do have a phone number, and it's there so that you can participate in our discussion. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N, 4676. If you'd like to share your thoughts with me, and I'll definitely make a point of bringing them to the fore when we get back together again next Monday, if you'd like to do that. If you'd like to send me an email, if for some reason you might be reluctant to go on the air with your ideas or your questions or considerations or whatever, and I fully understand that, then by all means feel free to sit down and send me an email, and I'll do the best I can to respond to your email and share it with our listeners if it seems pertinent to some of the issues that we've been raising. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. And I'd like to call your attention, finally, to our Facebook page. If you are a regular user of Facebook, you can go to the Facebook homepage and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will have access to our Facebook page. I've put a number of postings on it in recent weeks. The last one that I put on related specifically, as I recall, to Washington's farewell address. I posted a couple of paragraphs from Washington's farewell address on our Facebook page. So you might be interested. Let me, maybe as a prelude to next week's programs, if you go online and in your search engine, whether it be Explorer or Chrome or whatever, you might type in George Washington's farewell address, because that's what we'll be looking at. Or if you would prefer, you can go to our Facebook page and look at the most recent posting on there, which includes a couple of what I think are key paragraphs from Washington's farewell address that refer to the idea of political parties, at least from the mind or the position of President George Washington in 1796. So I invite you to do that. With that, then, let's begin. I have a short document here that I pulled off the internet, and I didn't date it, and I didn't entitle it. I can't remember where I got it, to be honest with you, but I have it in my papers. It's very recent, and it applies so clearly to our topic today, which is the idea or the issue of an impending Article 5 convention to amend the Constitution of the United States, that I thought it was probably the most pertinent, direct, on-target introduction to our topic today that I can imagine. It's written from a very, very concerned point of view. It's written from a point of view which suggests that an Article 5 convention to amend the Constitution would be very dangerous. Since that is my position, since that's the position I hope to explain today, I thought that it would be quite appropriate to use this particular piece as an introduction to our topic today. So with that, let me share it with you. It's not long, but it seems to lay out the issue about as clearly as it can be addressed. Americans can amend the Constitution in two ways. This is Article 5 of the Constitution of the United States. Americans can amend the Constitution in two ways. according to Article 5 of the Constitution. The first is for Congress to propose an amendment with two-thirds majority in both chambers that must then be ratified by 3/4 of the states. Congress, 2/3 of Congress, approves the particular amendment, and when 2/3 of the members of both chambers, the House and the Senate, approve the amendment, it goes out to the states for ratification. In order to become part of the Constitution of the United States, it must be endorsed by 3/4 of the states. This is the route that has been used to pass all 27 amendments to the Constitution that have been approved so far. In other words, the second approach, which we're going to focus on today, the convention approach, has never been used successfully. So none of the amendments to the Constitution of the United States that presently exist have gone through the convention process. All of them have met the requirement of passing 2/3 of both houses of Congress and then being approved by 3/4 of the states. The second strategy, the convention strategy, requires the same numbers associated. In other words, 2/3 of the states call a convention for proposing amendments or a particular amendment, proposing amendments. But the Constitution is silent about who might attend the convention, what it could or could not do once it convenes. But again, whatever happens at the convention becomes part of the Constitution when it's approved by 3/4 of the states. The author of this particular piece, and I might say I subscribe totally to this, this is a recipe for trouble. As you might expect, the author says, the trouble here is coming from the right and its patrons, its billionaire patrons, the people that are pumping big money into our political process. Already, 27 states have active calls for a convention on a balanced budget amendment, which would force the federal government to pass budgets that don't enlarge the national debt, thereby preventing the federal government from stimulating the economy during economic downturns. What we're confronted with then is it's only going to take 7 more states passing such a request to convene a constitutional convention. This strategy for amending the Constitution is, as it exists now, with 27 states already having requested a constitutional amendment, requested a convention for purposes of adopting a constitutional amendment on a balanced budget, stands only 7 votes shy of the 2/3 required by Article 5 of the Constitution. It's a real possibility. And this is what makes it even more a likely possibility. During state legislative sessions, which are going on right now in many states, we have one here going on right now here in West Virginia. It's a Republican-controlled legislature. At least 10 states that are currently in the midst of their legislative sessions have bills pending calling for a constitutional convention under Article 5. If 7 of those pass, we've got it. Some of the Republican candidates for president are endorsing such a convention. Organized groups, right-wing groups, like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and we spent quite a bit of time on it, have been holding workshops and crafting model legislation to persuade state legislatures to move on this important issue. There's more. Of late, many progressives, many liberals, disturbed, I think advisedly disturbed, as I am, by the Citizens United decision and by the amount of corporate and billionaire money that's pouring into our political process. Many progressives see a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United as a likely way, as a good way, a positive way to go in undoing Citizens United. Consequently, many progressives, as well as conservatives then, are moving in the same direction, which is in the direction of a constitutional convention. And one of the things that has been proposed from a number of different sources is that maybe there's a compromise available or possible here. Namely, progressives or liberals would be willing to go along with the balanced budget amendment in return for reversing Citizens United. In other words, both groups seem to be looking at an Article 5 convention as a positive strategy, as a workable strategy for amending the Constitution. Conservatives want a balanced budget amendment. But to be honest, so also do many liberals. Many liberals, many progressives believe that the size of the debt is too long, is too large. And so they kind of lean toward the idea of some sort of balanced budget amendment as well. They don't want to disarm the federal government, as do conservatives. But at the same time, they really believe that it's important to establish some kind of limit or some kind of controls on government spending. Most states are required to do that under their state constitutions. So, in other words, the situation seems to be moving toward the possibility of some kind of compromise. My amendment for your amendment. Folks, this is the Constitution of the United States. It's not draw poker. This is dangerous. Here's the fact. Once a constitutional convention is called, the issues considered by it cannot be limited. At least there's nothing in the Constitution to dictate, or in the papers or letters from the founders surrounding the Constitution. There's nothing to limit or to control or to regulate the behavior of such a convention. There's nothing in the Constitution to dictate who should attend. There's nothing in the Constitution to dictate what happens once the convention convenes. This means that every protection, every constitutional right that Americans have under the Constitution could conceivably be subject to change. Harvard Law professor Lawrence Tribe has said that such an Article 5 convention would be, quote, putting the whole Constitution up for grabs, unquote. That seems to me to lay out the issue. It lays out the problem. I think what we need to do is go back and look at some of the substance. This is a piece that I found I periodically do internet searches on the Article 5 convention because it's something that I'm very concerned about, very interested in. So a week doesn't go by that I'll go on the internet and just do a search just in case there's something that I missed or something that has surfaced that I didn't know about before or something like that. And lo and behold, I came across one a piece that was written in 2011. It was written 5 years ago by a PhD named Matthew Spalding. I think part of the reason that I didn't pick up on this particular piece before is because, let me tell you who Matthew Spalding is. Matthew Spalding is director of the B. Kenneth Simon Center for American Studies at the Heritage Foundation. He's also executive editor for the Heritage Guide to the Constitution. Basically, this is an article on an Article 5 convention written by a key spokesman for the Heritage Foundation. And I am guessing, and I can't swear to this, but I'm guessing that one of the reasons that I didn't pull it before is because I assumed by who wrote it, and this tells you how dangerous it is to assume. I assumed because of who wrote it that I knew what it was going to say. I know what the Heritage Foundation position is on a second convention. More specifically, I know what the Heritage Foundation position is on a balanced budget. And so therefore, I made the logical connection between the two and concluded that this article was one that I really didn't need to pull for attention because it was one that I already knew pretty much what it said. I was wrong. And it turns out that this particular piece, written by Professor Spalding 5 years ago in 2011, seems to me to provide even more evidence about the dangers of an Article 5 convention. Let me be specific. Matthew Spalding, the author of this piece, basically cautions on the dangers of an Article 5 convention. This from a major official in the Heritage Foundation 5 years ago. In other words, even the people who are pushing it now cautioned during much less volatile political times that this was dangerous. What we are getting now is that almost to the letter, those on the right side of the political spectrum, conservatives, Republicans, right-wingers, whatever you might want to call them, are cautioning people that the Article 5 convention is not that bad an idea and that it's not nearly as dangerous as opponents claim that it is, and I'm one of those opponents. In fact, Matthew Spalding, in this 2011 piece, opens by suggesting that progressives themselves fall into the category of those who want an Article 5 convention. This is what he says. Advocates of a living constitution, and that kind of fits the bill for me, a constitution, in other words, that adjusts and adapts to changing circumstances. Advocates of a living constitution, Spalding says, argue that the Founders' Constitution is hopelessly outdated and unable to grow and adapt to the times. The amendment procedure detailed in Article 5 belies such claims. And then it quotes Madison, James Madison himself, who wrote that the amendment procedure allows subsequent generations to correct errors and make whatever, quote, useful alterations will be suggested by experience. So what Spalding sets out to do in 2011 is to suggest that it's not just conservatives, it's not just the Heritage Foundation that supports the idea of an Article 5 convention. Those who advocate the living Constitution, those who advocate the idea that the Constitution has to adapt to changing circumstances, even they point to the Article 5 convention as a way to do it, because their dream of a living Constitution, of adaptation of the Constitution, is too difficult under the current amendment system. The easiest way to update the Constitution and make it more relevant, Spalding is suggesting, is with an Article 5 convention. Spalding also points out that amendment, the idea of building amendments into constitutions, is a very traditional thing. That founders, those who those who preceded us at the time of the founding and even before, during the colonial period, recognized that a constitution that could not be adapted, could not be changed, could not last. He mentions that even the charters or the constitutions, because that's what a charter is for a colony, is a constitution. William Penn's Constitution in Pennsylvania in 1682 and 1683 had a provision for amendment, as did many of the three of the state constitutions that were adopted at the time of independence. In other words, there was a recognition from the very beginning, Spalding suggests, that a constitution, if it was going to last, had to be adaptable. And so what he's suggesting here, this is obviously an appeal to progressives or to liberals, is that if you are in favor of the so-called living Constitution, then you too ought to look seriously at the benefits of an Article 5 convention. And then Spalding goes through the Constitutional Convention, specifically focusing, of course, on Article 5 itself. And this is, I think, straight from the sources. The Virginia Plan, introduced at the start of the Constitutional Convention, called for amendment, quote, whensoever it shall seem necessary, unquote. At the very beginning of the Constitutional Convention, when James Madison's Virginia Plan was introduced, there was mention of building in an amendment procedure based on the idea that we just addressed, that if the Constitution couldn't adapt to changing circumstances, it could not last. This directly from James Madison. This is quite consistent with Madison's papers and letters. There's no question that Madison believed this. I'm saying all of this because we get this position today by Antonin Scalia and some of the constitutionalists on the extreme right about originalism and about the idea that the Constitution must be interpreted by the court as it was originally written. In other words, that we ought not to consider adaptation or change, the idea of a living Constitution, in the way we interpret the constitutionality of man-made law at all. When the Virginia Plan was introduced and discussed at the Constitutional Convention, Spaulding tells us, the Committee of Detail, the committee of the convention appointed to refine what had been proposed. And the Committee of Detail, as I recall, met in early July you remember the Constitutional Convention goes from late May and adjourns on September 17th. So it's a little bit more than halfway through the convention. A committee of detail is created in order to try to pull together all the discussions and all the recommendations and all the proposals that have been made up to that point and lay them out before the convention as a whole, so, in a sense, so we can know where we stand. That Committee of Detail proposed a process whereby Congress would call for a constitutional convention on the request of 2/3 of the state legislatures. What Spaulding is emphasizing is that the idea of a convention, which ends up in Article 5, was introduced at the very beginning of the process, the very beginning of the Constitutional Convention. At that point, when the Committee of Detail made its report about a convention system based on 2/3 of the state legislatures being included in the Constitution, George Mason immediately raised an objection, claiming that this was not enough to protect the states. Mason was the architect, the major, the delegate most concerned with the idea of a Bill of Rights and protecting individual rights. Most relevant was Alexander Hamilton, who responded to the Committee of Detail report by saying that actually Congress itself should be able to propose amendments independent of the states. Hamilton's position is, this is important, Hamilton's position is, if you limit the amendment process to conventions, state conventions, you deny Congress the opportunity to amend the Constitution. So Hamilton's position is there needs to be a provision whereby Congress itself can recommend amendments to the Constitution. James Madison, as recorded in his own notes of the debates, thought that the convention system was problematic, and he urged the convention to reject the convention system. Quote, "How was a convention to be formed?" Madison said in his notes. "By what rule decide? What would be the force of its acts?" After additional debate, the delegates at the Constitutional Convention passed Madison's language, seconded by Alexander Hamilton, that the national legislature, the Congress, shall propose amendments when 2/3 of each house deems it necessary, or on the application of 2/3 of the state legislatures. It was Madison and Hamilton who added the right of Congress to propose amendments. Remember, their priority is the strong and powerful central government under the Constitution. By having only the state procedure for amendments included in the amendment process, you really threatened federal power. By putting Congress in there as an originator of amendments, you counterbalance that threat. And so ultimately, what becomes Article 5 emerges from those kinds of considerations and that kind of debate. In other words, it is very important that we recognize that Congress seriously debated, the convention seriously debated two methods of ratification. One, a state-driven system requesting a convention and requiring Congress to convene one. The second, proposed by Hamilton and seconded by Madison, allowed amendments to come from Congress to be ratified by the states, by 3/4 of the states. As we know from looking at the Federalist Papers here in previous programs at the Virtual Center, Madison and Hamilton both believed that the congressional origins of amendments would likely be the only one ever used. Hamilton said, and made the point in one of the Federalist Papers, that these states are so divided, are so selfish about their own rights and their own interests, that it's naive to expect that 2/3 of them would agree on much of anything. Hamilton was concerned then that the need to update and adapt the Constitution to changing circumstances would never happen if it was dependent totally on amendments coming from a state convention, from a convention called by 2/3 of the states. Much more likely, Madison argued, was that amendments would come from the top down. And as we know from the very last Federalist paper, number 85, written by Alexander Hamilton, which is a summary of all the other Federalist papers as explanations of exactly how the Constitution was intended to work, how it was drafted, and what it was intended to do, Hamilton makes the point that when you're amending the Constitution, it's much more important that the amendments come from the top down for approval than that they come from the bottom up. For one thing, he believed that the politics of the period suggested that nothing would ever come from the bottom up. It couldn't happen. There was not enough agreement among the states to expect it. Consequently, needed change in the Constitution would not and could not happen unless you made a provision for Congress to pass the necessary amendments or to create the necessary amendments. But we are a federal system, and it's very important that the states have the opportunity to ratify them. And that, as we know, is the way the Constitution of the United States itself comes into being. It is drafted by a convention, and it is ratified by the states. And that, I would suggest, is significant. Let's go back. Prior to the Constitutional Convention, to the Annapolis Convention of September 1786, which adopted the call for the Constitutional Convention. I'm not going to go back through all the story of the Annapolis Convention. We spent an entire program on the Annapolis Convention. If you recall, the Annapolis Convention was almost a failure because only 5 states showed up. Only 11 delegates from 5 different states showed up. It was almost a failure. But as our textbook tells us, Alexander Hamilton pulled likely defeat and turned it into victory with the Annapolis Convention. Hamilton was able to get a resolution, a call for a constitutional convention through the Annapolis Convention. And there's no question, one of the reasons he was able to do it is because there were only 11 delegates there. And most of the 11 were in the camp of the nationalists. In other words, they were sympathetic to the ideas of Hamilton, Madison, and the others about strengthening the central government and about the need to revise the Articles of Confederation. But Hamilton knew that more was necessary than revising the Articles of Confederation. He and Madison had concluded that what was going to be necessary were not amendments to the Articles of Confederation, but rather a total revamping, if not scrapping, of the Articles of Confederation and a totally new system. The evidence that that was the thinking comes from the fact that when the Constitutional Convention opened, Madison had ready for introduction the Virginia Plan. Madison was already prepared for a convention that would choose to scrap entirely the Articles of Confederation and start all over again with a whole new constitutional system. The way that Hamilton was able to do it was the way that the call for the Constitutional Convention was written. Hamilton drafted the report, the official report of the Annapolis Convention, which was a report delivered to Congress requesting that Congress call an amendment to revise the Articles of Confederation. But it did more than that. Hamilton wrote that report, and he was very careful not to limit the charge of the convention only to revising the articles. And for that, he took the instructions of New Jersey delegate Abraham Clark, who came to the Annapolis Convention with instructions from the New Jersey legislature that went beyond amending the Articles of Confederation. In Clark's instructions, there was a provision in there that the convention to be called would consider a uniform system of commercial regulations and other important matters that might be necessary to the common interest and permanent harmony of the several states. Hamilton took that language from Abraham Clark's New Jersey instructions and incorporated them verbatim, those words, into the final report of the Annapolis Convention. Consequently, the report as written by Alexander Hamilton reads as follows. In this persuasion, your commissioners submit an opinion that the idea of extending the powers of their deputies to other objects than those of commerce, which has been adopted by the state of New Jersey, was an improvement on the original plan and will deserve to be incorporated into that of a future convention. What Hamilton is proposing then is that the Annapolis Convention issues a report, which he writes, which requests Congress to call a constitutional convention for the express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation or other matters which might be deemed necessary to address the concerns of the nation at large. What's the issue here? What's the point? Hamilton and Madison have effectively, I know who I'm talking about. I'm talking about our founding fathers here. But there's absolutely no question that they conspired to manipulate the charge, the call for the Constitutional Convention in order to make it possible for themselves to not be limited to amending the Articles of Confederation, but instead be given the authority to totally scrap it and replace it with a different system. What am I saying? The only constitutional convention that we've had so far, the original Constitutional Convention, was manipulated by its leading proponents in such a way that it would become a, quote, runaway convention. The big issue in debate today about the calling of an Article 5 convention to propose or pass a balanced budget amendment, to undo Citizens United, whatever the express purpose of such a convention would be. The major debate focuses around the absence of detailed instructions from the founders on who ought to be at the convention or what it can or cannot do. The issue, of course, is whether, in fact, the convention will be limited to the specific issues for which it is called, or whether the convention will become a runaway convention. By runaway convention, we mean whether, in fact, the entire Constitution will be on the table, as Lawrence Tribe predicts. Conservatives, principally conservatives, are arguing that the convention could adopt rules amongst themselves. The delegates could adopt their own rules of behavior, which would require them to stick to the script, stick to the specific amendments or the specific considerations for which the convention is called. But the fact of the matter is there's all sorts of evidence floating around the country, all sorts of publications, conservative talk radio, traditional terrestrial talk radio, Rush Limbaugh's program, other programs, Mark Levin's program, are talking about the opportunities available to get rid of portions of the Constitution itself that conservatives don't like once this convention opens. In other words, they are talking amongst themselves about the fact that this convention can become runaway once it convenes. The only experience we've had so far is the 1787 Constitutional Convention, and it indeed became a runaway convention. It did not stick to the agenda for which it was called. Most states sent delegates believing that the convention was specifically to focus on commercial issues and to revise the Articles of Confederation in order to meet those commercial concerns, trade concerns. But Hamilton and Madison had fixed it. They had manipulated the situation to the point. They had given themselves an opening to turn the convention from a limited convention to a wide open convention, which felt that it was empowered to scrap the Articles of Confederation entirely and to replace it with an entirely new system of government, which becomes the Constitution of the United States. My point, there is absolutely no evidence to indicate. There's nothing to indicate, no experience to indicate, no language to indicate, nothing to indicate that once an Article 5 convention comes into being, the entire Constitution of the United States will not be on the table and open for revision. What kind of revision? Let me point out that there are 27 state legislatures which have already requested a constitutional convention for the purpose of a balanced budget amendment. We know that most of these 27 states so far are Republican-controlled states. Most of them are dominated by conservative interests, Republican interests. And when we look at the Mark Levins and Rush Limbaughs and the spokesmen, the advocates of an Article 5 convention, they are the sources of much of the concern. Mark Levin's book, written in 2010 or 11, I believe, called The Liberty Amendments, proposes 11 specific amendments to the Constitution of the United States, which would effectively scrap the Constitution of the United States and give us back something like the Articles of Confederation by returning power to the states. States which they control. Legislatures which they control. Levin's amendments would give state legislatures the power to overturn laws of Congress. It would overturn decisions of the Supreme Court. It would eliminate lifetime appointments for members of the Supreme Court. It would, as proposed, include, one of the amendments would be a balanced budget amendment. Another would establish term limits. What I'm suggesting is that those who are best able currently to drive their own political priorities through state legislatures that they control are the ones advocating the loudest for an Article 5 convention. This is not the time to do it. There's too much out there to suggest danger. There's too much evidence from the founders themselves that an Article 5 convention is the last thing that we don't want to allow to happen.
Hey, Dr. Bill?
Yes, Bob?
I note that we're right up against the top of the hour, but I wanted to make a suggestion, if I might, please.
Please do.
When we return from the break,
right?
Could we? And I think Horst is going to want to jump into the conversation as well.
Okay.
Could we? I'm not sure what Horst wants to bring to the table, but I know I have a couple of specific questions relative to one, textual analysis, and two, some philosophical stuff. Could we, with everything you set forward for this in this first hour, as sort of foundation and prologue, could we go in that direction? Let's do it. That's exactly what I hope to set up in the first hour, Bob. Wonderful. I thank you very, very much. Why don't we pause and take our break now? We're at 59 minutes after. We are at the top of the hour. So let's pause and take our 5-minute break right now, and then we'll come back. We'll get Horst on the line, and we'll take on the issue of the Article 5 convention in an open discussion. Sounds great to me. Sounds great to me, too. Thank you, Bob. All right. We will be right back then. Thank you so much, Bob. We'll be right back with the Virtual Center. Please stay with us. 5-minute break, and that's all. It is 4 minutes past the hour, and let's return to Dr. Bill O'Brien and the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Dr. Bill, we've got Horst online with us, I think, and hope he stays that way. Hey, Horst. Are you there?
I hope so. Am I here?
You are there. You are there.
That's a
Hey,
start.
that's a good name for a TV program. You Are There.
Right.
Remember that one?
Or alternatively, Am I Here? But
Am I Here? Yeah. Hey, great to hear from you.
Good to be here.
I guess our topic is an Article 5 convention. We kind of been here before, but I think the issue is presenting more and more complications and becoming a greater and greater threat.
Well, I'm trying to think. When did you first bring this topic up? I mean, has it been over a year now?
It's been years.
Fairly prescient, I believe.
A couple of years ago. I saw the danger, and I saw the fact that, in fact, one of the programs that I want to do in the not-too-distant future is based on an article by Thomas Edsall that appeared, about 6-7 months ago in the New York Times, in which he is talking about the Republican strategy of going state by state, whereas the Democrats have continued to focus on the top-down approach of getting stuff through Congress and ratified by the president. And he points out how successful the Republican strategy is becoming and how Democrats are beginning to recognize that and beginning to try to make accommodations. But Edsall's point is it may be too little too late. And the Article 5 convention is a key part of that. I think it got so close to becoming a reality before people began to realize how serious it was. When you begin to look at all the pieces of the puzzle, when you put them together, it was kind of clear that was what was going on.
Well, I see it, personally, I see it as part of the ongoing right-wing insurgency in this country. And part of what I wanted to, to the extent that I and my hubris can do this, part of the direction I wanted to sort of push the conversation, Dr. Bill, is in this, I've made no bones about the fact that I think it is an act, I think I've used the phrase political simpletons to describe the progressives who want an Article 5 convention of the states. I've referred to it as being naive. Mm-hmm. I, like you, and largely because of you, think this is a very, very dangerous idea. Not in the least because of the way that Article 5 itself is worded.
Right.
In laying out the history of it, I find it interesting that the alternative that Madison insisted upon is what comes first.
Right.
When 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary. In other words, the congressional approach, even though that was not the favored approach,
no.
Madison's idea gets pride of place, as it were.
Right.
And then the Convention of the States, which, of course, as you note, has never been used, and for awfully good reason, I think. I find it interesting that even in the rancor of the 1850s that led up to the Civil War, and the 1840s for that matter, was anybody pushing this? Was anybody saying, "Hey, let's get together and just have a redo"?
Bob, the interesting thing is there's one instance where it was, and it was James Madison near the very end of his life. In 1832, when the nation was really struggling with South Carolina over the so-called nullification controversy, the Calhoun's position that the states had the authority, constitutional authority, to nullify federal legislation. In this case, it was the tariff of 1828, the so-called Tariff of Abominations, as Andrew Jackson defined it. Madison, at that time, said, maybe this is the time we might have to resort in the 11th hour. He didn't say 11th hour, but he said, in this kind of an emergency, maybe the only way to save the Constitution is an Article 5 convention where we resolve this issue before it splits the nation in half. And so basically, Madison, at the end of his life, he dies I believe he dies in 1836, 4 years later. But Madison saw the Article 5 convention approach to amendment as kind of an absolutely last-ditch effort when all else fails. And it looks like the nation is going to be torn apart. And under those circumstances, he said that might be the time, because there's no other option left, to resort to the Article 5 convention strategy for finding a way out of this. It never happened, as you know, that Jackson forced South Carolina to back down and you threatened military force and all the rest of it, and the issue became a non-issue very quickly. But the fact of the matter is, later on, and this is according to, I saw this in Spalding, and I had forgotten about this. Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War issue, let me see if I can put my finger on this, because I don't want to misquote this. Well, I'm kind of stuck now. Basically, Lincoln suggests the possibility of the same kind of thing when it looks like the nation is going to be destroyed, be torn asunder with secession. But then, interestingly enough, after the war starts, when the debate, and this is the movie, the Lincoln movie, the story of the ratification of the 13th Amendment, Lincoln himself supports the idea of getting it through Congress and out to the states for ratification. In other words, he totally abandons the idea of an Article 5 convention once he's comfortable with the fact that the Union has a chance to win this war. But those times are the only times. Other than that, it's a top-down approach to ratifying the Constitution, which Hamilton made the point that this is the only safe way to do it.
Well, so I was mistaken in my assertion, but to look at the, it strikes me that even within the language, because the language is kind of loose and pliable in Article 5, and it's not entirely clear as to, must it be, as you note, for instance, 27 states saying they want a balanced budget amendment?
No.
It doesn't have to be that. But it does seem to me that by operation of law, by operation of the Constitution, a convention of the states would have to be called within the purview of the Constitution. So that means that everything is still in play, and there would, I presume, be litigation to the Supreme Court as to the legitimacy and sufficiency of the call by the states.
Yeah. The Article 5 convention doesn't necessarily make the Constitution of the United States no longer in effect or no longer operative. You're right. And so the Constitution of the United States remains the law of the land, even as such an Article 5 convention would be meeting. And that would mean that
but what happens when the thing is gavelled in that matters.
Yeah, exactly. And once that happens, nobody has any control over it. There's no regulation anywhere in anybody's language. In other words, the only thing that you would have the possibility of is the wisdom of the delegates who are at the convention to agree amongst themselves that they would stick to this particular issue. And there's no guarantee to do that. There's no way to enforce that.
Sorry, I just wanted to interject a couple of points that just occurred to me listening to the two of you converse here. One, it actually seems kind of an extraordinary notion, the idea that there would ever be a need for an Article 5 convention when you consider how far removed the public opinion and the public needs would have to be from the workings of Congress itself. I mean, if representative government worked the way it was designed to do, then it would be kind of inconceivable that the people themselves would ever have to even undergo the burden of organizing to such an extent at a local level the bar for achieving an Article 5 convention by itself is pretty steep compared to the normal operations of Congress, which means that to even get to that point, there would have to be like a massive disconnect between what the public perception of their representation in government is versus what was actually taking place.
Right.
If you follow my meaning.
I do, but
the second thing.
Okay, I was just going to say.
The second thing that occurred to me, just to cap that off real quick, is that this has happened, as you point out, only a couple of times in history, and in both of those cases, it's always been when the situation had actually approached something close to civil war. I mean, like it was the direst of emergencies that even occasioned that kind of thing happening. And now look where we are now.
Right.
It's just it's interesting to note that like the last time we contemplated such a thing, we're on the brink of civil war, and now what it's taken to precipitate this idea. Well, okay, setting aside ideas of like a balanced budget amendment, which okay, well, whatever, but like it's actually getting steam now under the auspices of the emergency, the perceived emergency or threat of political contributions overwhelming the entire Democratic or Republican, whatever you want to call it, process. Mm-hmm. Anyway, those are my two thoughts. I'll let you get back to it.
I think you're right. No. I mean. I think you're right. The only thing I was going to say is that Bob is really onto something about the language, and it's interesting. Let me, and this is from that Spalding article that I was mentioning earlier. He makes one point which I think is very, very interesting. He says some scholars maintain that such attempts, in other words, limiting an Article 5 convention to a single specific amendment, some scholars, he says, maintain that such attempts violate the language of Article 5. Because Article 5 says that upon application of the states, Congress, quote, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, not for confirming particular amendments that have already been written, approved, and proposed by state legislatures. So what he's pointing out is some people argue that the use of the word proposed means that whatever happens at an Article 5 convention has to happen in it. It has to happen there. It can't happen before the convention convenes.
Or in other words, the proposal takes place before or after the convention is called.
Yes, exactly.
Right, yeah.
But the presumption is that for instance, Mark Levin, the guy with a voice made for print, his Liberty amendments would be null and void, and that any balanced budget amendment, for instance, would have to be actually drafted in convention.
Right, and that would negate ALEC's model amendments being passed around,
and it would also negate Wolfpack's Citizens United amendment.
Right.
Yeah, but at the same time, how do you define like when something is drafted? I mean, like okay,
well,
so
sure, and that's
party A drafts an amendment, and okay, that happened before the fact, but I'm party D, and I just happen to find this piece of paper that outlines all these ideas, and now that the convention's been called, I can introduce it under my own auspices. I mean, I don't see how that is any more than
right,
just a
or you walk through the door with your ALEC model legislation.
Well, that's how they operate now.
And you take it right. That's how they operate in the legislatures of the several states. You don't introduce ALEC stuff. ALEC hands Delegate Thumbfingers the model legislation, and he has somebody in his office or her office type it up and submit it under his own name. It's a sort of legislative plagiarism.
Right.
And so I think Dr. Bill and Horst, I think that argument is somewhat specious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all you'd have to do.
I don't think it works at all. Yeah.
Oh no, all you'd have to do, for example, is if you introduced an amendment and somebody made a proposal and said, "I think we ought to capitalize that T," and it passes, then effectively the amendment has been created in the convention. If you make one change in something that's proposed as a draft, then you can claim that what comes out of it has been proposed, has been drafted at the or designed or formulated at the convention.
Yeah, Mr. President, give me a semicolon or give me death.
Yeah, exactly. That's my point.
And less comically, like this happens every day in the world of print publication. If you can take something it's been in the public domain for 100 years and you just write a new introduction to it. Right, and you can republish it under your own.
You can republish it under your own name. Plagiarism is very, very difficult to prove.
Yeah. The bar is very high for that.
But I really think that this whole idea of the language of Article 5 in this particular case I agree with you. It's kind of far-fetched and it's probably not real. But that the irony is, it's the only indication that there's any sort of guidance on what happens within that convention, because there's no indication as to who ought to be in it. Madison said in Federalist number 49 that the greatest threat of a constitutional convention is that the people pushing for it the hardest will dominate the convention. In other words, once the convention is successful, once it meets, then the people pushing for it have already won, because they'll dominate it. They're the ones with the agenda. They'll come in with a plan ready to go, which ironically is what Madison did.
Right. Well, he literally wrote the handbook. And see, the thing is, there was no federal judiciaries to speak of to even address questions of, because let's remember, the Articles of Confederation required 100% agreement in order to modify them, did they not?
They did. They really did. And of course, the fact of the matter is, Rhode Island was not even at the Constitutional Convention. They refused to go. So that meant that there was no possibility legally to revise the Articles of Confederation because one state wasn't even there. So the convention theoretically should have adjourned and gone home if they had stuck to the provisions of the Articles of Confederation.
Right, and that's what I mean when and I've gotten some pushback when I have said, look, when this convention gavels in, the constitutional governance under which we operate as best we may ceases effectively to exist. When that convention gavels in, there's no obligation to send out the next month's Social Security check.
No, everything is on the table.
What happens to the United States military when this thing gavels in?
Yeah. Okay, that's a good point.
What happens to the full faith and credit clause? What happens to the contractual obligations of the federal government? Because we have to. I think in considering the universe of all of this, and I don't mean to dominate this.
No, you're not. You're not. Go right ahead.
But we have to consider the political climate, just as Madison and Hamilton did. Mm-hmm. And we have a political climate in this country that is suffused with a significant minority, if not a plurality, and possibly a majority for all we can tell, depending on how one views the various states. God, I'm talking like Madison writes. God almighty.
Yeah. It's pretty cool.
That is in which this right-wing, anti-government, anti-federal, so-called states' rights, sovereign citizen, Tea Party, what have you, is broadly accepted. I mean, there's a thing that went down last night out in Oregon that was brought on by people who read a constitution that apparently is not written in the same language that I even understand.
No, they basically reinterpret the Constitution in the way that suits themselves, and they basically throw the gauntlet to somebody else and say it's up to you to prove that we're not right. And you can't do that. You can't prove a negative.
You can't prove a negative. No. So when this thing gavels in, if it has in fact been called by a majority, by a 2/3 majority of the states, most of whom, if not all of whom, will be right-wing governments. Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's say sane governments like Massachusetts and California, maybe New York. I doubt if they'll sit it out.
No,
because just to elaborate, even the sane governments, what team is going to have their A game?
Well, right.
There's going to be a contingent from California. There's going to be a contingent from Massachusetts. There's going to be a contingent from New York of Republicans and sympathizers who have already been preparing for this for a long time. So they may be even in those states they may be outnumbered, but they're still prepared. They know what's coming. They're ready to go. So there's that to take into consideration too. But anyway,
no, you're right. You're right because once this happens, then the rules are suspended, And what that means is even majority rule no longer operates. I mean, if the Horst is talking about the Massachusetts contingent or the California contingent, it may be totally out of line with the majority of the people of California, but the old principle of the silent majority, if the majority of the people of California aren't at the convention, then this minority, until proven otherwise, has the right to speak for the state of California.
Precisely.
Yeah,
what if the right-wing majority of states refuses to seat a liberal delegation from a so-called liberal state and instead seats a bunch of teabaggers?
Right. Or
credentials them.
Bundy-like people or something like that.
Even contrary to established rules and procedures. One thing I was going to bring up that this reminds me of is let's not forget the lessons of the Bush-Cheney administration, in which there are legitimate questions of enforcement capability. Okay, so the rules dictate that we do it this way. The law says we do it this way. But someone has got to be willing to enforce those laws. Bush and Cheney did a number of things just simply by saying, well, we're going to do what we want to do, and if you think you can stop us, step on up and try, and we'll just see. And they 80-90% of the time, they weren't even challenged. Now, what happens when you have a constitutional convention with 30 states controlled by, right-wing Tea Party types who are just trying to pull, and they will automatically attempt to achieve the maximum in every. It's like trying to process a claim with an insurance company. They're going to deny you every chance they get just to see how hard you want to fight for it. And it's the same. It's the same principle that governs how the right wing works politically.
Right. And it goes back to something we've referenced in the past. It's Andrew Jackson's response to being slapped down on the Indian Removal Act. Justice Taney has made his ruling. Now let him enforce it.
Right.
We go from the social contract to the law of the jungle, and the jungle can reassert itself at any moment.
And so the idea that the convention would operate by the same rules that the nation operates before the convention is convened is not necessarily true.
Well,
once that gavel comes down, you can come up with a whole new set of rules.
Well, there's nothing even in Article 5 that says what shall be required in convention for an amendment to be deemed proposed.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
It could very well be that simply walking in and dropping your proposal in the bucket, and you send the whole bucket out to the several states, because that much Article 5 does say. It then has to go to the states for ratification.
Right.
But it proposes no rules for ratification, though. Or even rules for proposal.
The only rule is that it takes 3/4 of the states to approve it. And so basically what that means is the 34, the required minimum number of 34 to be 2/3 becomes, I think, 38 or something like that, 39 or something. But the chances are very good that they're going to have that number. Madison, in number 49, Madison, he's cautioning against the convention. Keep in mind that the reason Madison endorsed the Bill of Rights was to keep a second convention from
being called. Absolutely.
From happening. That's all you need to hear. The whole system. And he said, under the present circumstances, every agreement, every compromise that we were able to reach will be back on the table, and that'll be the end of it. Everything we accomplished will be lost. And Madison says that the dangers of the convention are the same people who are pushing hardest for it will control it. And then he says, toward the very end of number 49, he said it would be pronounced by the very men who had been agents in or opponents of the measures to which the decision would relate. The passions, therefore, not the reason of the public, would sit in judgment, but it is reason alone of the public that ought to control and regulate the government. The passions ought to be controlled and regulated by the government. In other words, if you have a cabal, a faction, and I think what we're talking about is a 34-state faction here, because it's controlled by big money coming from Kansas, from Wichita, Kansas, and other places, then you've got a cabal operating, and Madison's position is when that situation exists, you don't and you don't have a convention. You don't give them a stage.
Yeah, had he been working within something other than the oeuvre of his time, he might have described it as what you have then is a putsch.
Yeah, a putsch. Right, exactly. I mean, this is a revolution. This is within the confines of the Constitution of the United States. This is a potential revolution, and the drafters, Madison and Hamilton, the keys to drafting, never believed that Article 5 would ever be used. So the question is, why the hell did they even include it? And the answer is because if they didn't, the states wouldn't have ratified the Constitution. You had to appear to be giving as much authority to the states as possible, but the way they framed it, they didn't really believe that the states were getting any real authority. It just looked like they did. On the 10th Amendment to the Bill of Rights, for example, when you pull the word expressly out of that amendment as it appeared in the Articles of Confederation, you turn the meaning of the amendment 180 degrees.
Well,
totally
you render
around.
the 10th Amendment was rendered an effective nullity.
Right. It basically, and all those people that point to it as a justification for states' rights, they could have included the word expressly, because that's the way the amendment was proposed. That's the way it read in the Articles of Confederation. And by consciously pulling that word out, they knew that they were denying the states the power they thought they had, but at the same time they were doing it in a way that the states would not catch.
Well, right. They were trying to defang a viper without the viper knowing it had been defanged.
Exactly. That's exactly what they did, Bob. And, and so they never believed that, they didn't think that Article 5, the convention portion of Article 5, would ever be a problem, because it appeared to give the states the power to amend the Constitution that they wanted. So if the threat of federal power ever became too great, they could just get together in a convention and amend the Constitution. And Madison and Hamilton believed that would never be possible. Well, what's happening now with technology, with money, big money, and all the rest of it, it is becoming possible.
Well, let me push this.
It's scary as hell.
It's terrifying. And again, I'm filibustering, and I apologize, but there's so much that I wanted to make sure that we sort of crammed into these 2 tiny hours. I want to address us. I would like for us to address ourselves specifically to the question of this allegedly progressive outfit called Wolfpack. Now, I don't like to be perceived as attacking another progressive or anything, but I find it intensely ironic that some people have founded a PAC in order to raise the money, and it is a money-making operation first and foremost, to go in and get the dirty money out of politics.
Yeah.
Now, the nature of a PAC is, the regulation of a PAC is kind of threadbare, to say the least. PACs can do almost as they wish. Are we in agreement?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if you've got a PAC and you're asking people to contribute money to your PAC for purposes of calling a constitutional convention of the states so that you can get the dirty money out of politics, guess what you've done? You've created a way to provide a salary to the people running the PAC.
That's right.
And it is, as such, a hustle.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, I hope we can address ourselves to, and I hope we have sufficiently addressed ourselves to progressives of good intent, progressives of and liberals, whatever we're calling ourselves, of goodwill, mm-hmm. who honestly and earnestly want the dirty money out of politics, a concept with which I wholeheartedly agree.
Mm-hmm.
But this idea that we're going to sashay into a convention of the states, that we're going to lock arms with the right wingers who and I want to kind of go back here for a second and say, consider these things that are not merely articles of political preference among the right wing. They are articles of faith. Okay. Remember when Rick Perry couldn't remember all the government institutions that he wanted to destroy?
Right.
But he wanted to get rid of the EPA, and he wanted to get rid of the Department of Education, and he wanted to get rid of the IRS. Okay. What better way to achieve all of those things? And it's wild-eyed stuff.
You're really right, Bob. Than by an Article 5 convention.
That's exactly and of course,
right.
There are the people who think America is being destroyed by the anchor babies.
Right.
And I'm using the stupid voice, and I apologize for that.
And Bob, there's another reality to this group and this initiative that you're talking about, and that is the naivete to believe, because the bulk of the convention is going to be controlled by those conservative states that are there for the balanced budget amendment. And even the idea that you can swap one for the other, that you can get Citizens United overturned in return for your support of the balanced budget amendment. The fact of the matter is the supporters of the balanced budget amendment don't need you.
No, they don't.
They don't need you. I mean, why the hell should they compromise with you?
Right. You're going to walk in with your kazoos and your tambourines and your sheet music to Kumbaya, and you're going to negotiate and have consensus and compromise, and then they're going to take you out back and stomp a mud hole in you. If they have
38 states under Republican control, most of them, or many of them with Republican governors, then theoretically they've got the votes they need to ratify whatever comes out of that convention. They don't need to compromise with anybody.
At the same point, if they have 38 states, they don't need the complicity of anybody on the left to carry through with. They're going to do it anyway. Because
they don't need.
They'll have the momentum necessary.
Right. They don't need to compromise. They don't need to negotiate. They don't need to do anything.
And one more thing.
The idea about the sorry.
No, go ahead, Horst.
The sitting down and holding hands and the kazoos and stuff. As far as that goes, I just want to say, like, the other side of that argument is, I think, for the people that are forming this PAC, there may be some good salaries involved. It may actually be a hustle as it comes out to, but at the same time, I think it can be pitched at least as fighting fire with fire. Like, the only way we're going to be able to take on a massive concerted, organized pile of money is to make our own pile of money and fight back with it. And I think that's part of the rationale that's behind that.
Yeah, now, but Horst, it's a matter of fighting a flamethrower with a book of matches.
Sure, I get that. I get that. I don't know how sincere an effort that is. I'm just saying, like, it doesn't have to be, on the one hand, disingenuous, and on the other hand, it doesn't have to be entirely stupid either. It's just that it's like you say, it is somewhat misguided, and there are, and I know there are some genuine efforts out there to find common cause. Okay, well, we don't agree with the Tea Party about this, but we all know that money has too much influence in government, and
right.
So I don't really see that going anywhere. And to be honest with you, as things stand, I don't really see an Article 5 convention going anywhere either, simply because, once you open it up for discussion, there has to be a certain amount of consensus to pass anything, and I don't see that developing. What does scare me, though, is, like I said, it's like, if a sizable majority, whether it's 38 states or 37 or 36, if someone grabs enough momentum to just grab it anyway and say, hey, stop us if you can, that's what bothers me. That's what I worry about.
Then you don't need control. That's exactly right.
Right, and let's consider that one. Let's take them at their word that they're just going to go in and get a balanced budget amendment. Well, what does that mean? That means that the federal government no longer has the power to use the power of debt. Okay? Because beginning in the Civil War, the United States government discovered the majesty, if you will, of debt. Everything that comes from the Civil War onward is a function of the federal government's discovery, for all intents and purposes, of what it could do with debt and with a stable currency and with the full faith and credit of the Constitution backing everything the government did. I mean, all you have to do is walk around on Capitol Hill, and there's an entire neighborhood of stately, beautiful places that go for millions and millions of dollars when they sell now, and they were all and they are all a function of the massive population increase of D.C. in the years following, and it was all fueled on debt. Okay. Now, a balanced budget amendment says that the United States government's budget must be run like June and Ward Cleaver's household budget. Nobody can ever go into the red. Well, that means that Congress is constantly engaged in the business of cutting back things. So if you just happen to be a right winger who despises the idea of those people eating food that they didn't earn by their own hard labor, in other words, food stamps, well, then, you can wipe out the food stamp program.
Right.
If you think that women and infant children need to be out there participating in the economy, you can wipe out women and infant children. You can wipe out the IRS. I'm sorry, we've got a balanced budget amendment here, and we just don't have enough money to fund the IRS. In other words, everything. You remember when Grover Norquist talked about wanting to drown the government in the bathtub?
Right.
The balanced budget amendment is the bathtub.
Right.
And everything the right wing doesn't like goes into the bathtub.
You're exactly right. I mean, the balanced budget amendment is the key amendment for the right wing. There's no question. Because it's going to emasculate government. It's going to make it impossible. It's going to make it impossible for government to have enough the so-called discretionary money to address the public interest at all.
Well, I guess it's one of several prongs. I mean, the balanced budget is one thing, but at the same time, also voter ID laws and voter restrictions of all kinds, of course, also play a very big part in that. Because once you establish the rules for government, you have to be very careful about who's allowed to change those rules, right? So there's also that. Yeah. But then again, like you say, if we have an Article 5 convention, we can throw everything out. We can go back to the Articles of Confederation, or we can go to the Confederacy itself as such. I mean, like, who knows what they actually have in mind there?
Well, basically, right now, if you read Levin's amendments in the Liberty amendments, the common theme of his proposals is that every one of them would make it impossible for the federal government to do something that it's in the habit of doing.
Yeah, we'll kick things back to the states as much as possible. The one thing that kind of puzzles me is I don't understand why he wants to get rid of direct election of senators. That's a little peculiar to me.
Well, that's a sop thrown to the constitutional originalists.
Oh, is that what that is? Okay,
yeah,
because
that
was the original Constitution.
Because it doesn't seem to have any functional, utility that I can think of.
Oh, yes, it does.
I've been kicked. Well, like you say, as a sop to the constitutionalists, it serves a very
it serves
plenty function.
It serves a very real dogmatic purpose. You remember back during the reign of error when Karl Rove was talking about a permanent Republican majority.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Well, if the governors of these right-wing states, and for all intents and purposes, if you look at Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, the Confederacy, the odds of ever getting a Democratic governor in there within our generation is probably something approaching nil. So if the governor does the appointing, or even if the legislature does the appointing, that guarantees that the right wing has something near a perpetual majority in the United States Senate.
Yes, it does.
Well, up until the extent that there's always the possibility that enough populist resentment would channel itself into focusing more attention on local and state-based races.
Yeah, but remember the dirty money.
It might take a couple of generations to catch up, and it might not happen at all.
It's not going to happen at all, Horst, because the dirty money, it's not like they're going to do anything about Citizens United because they like it.
The thing is, though, money doesn't work on everybody equally. And this is something that I was talking with, I mentioned this to Dr. Bill on his Facebook page a couple of days ago, is that those, if you know what you're talking about, if you understand the issues, no amount of money and no amount of advertising in the world is going to sway your opinion.
Right.
And it's not simply a matter of education that you receive from schools and such. It's also simply just a matter of how much you're paying attention to what's going on around you.
Or the hard business of your life that is imposed upon you.
Also this, and the more power the more disempowered you feel at the national level, you may channel those energies into things going on around you more directly. And you can, as I hate to sound like a Pollyanna here, but it seems like we still have a lot of avenues open to channel political energy. The problem is largely a matter of complacency. It's not a matter of oppression. It's like people just do not feel moved enough one way or the other to get involved in the first place.
Let me gently disagree. I think a little bit, Horst.
Okay, sure.
Because and I'm going to bring racial politics into this, and if it's unfair, I apologize.
No, fine. Go ahead.
Consider the populations of South Carolina and Mississippi. Mm-hmm. Now, if people were fairly apportioned within legislative districts in both of those states, one could argue that the majority of the legislatures of both of those states, not to mention Alabama, probably Georgia, almost certainly Louisiana, would be majority African American. Mm-hmm. Okay?
All right.
They're not. And they're not because the legislature, now that the Civil Rights Act is effectively dead and the Voting Rights Act is effectively dead, well, there's people can get angry. They can become furious. They can march. They can go to candlelight vigils. They can do, and they can vote. I remember
the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were not effectively dead a couple of years ago, and yet the political reality a couple of years ago, going back the last 20 years, was still is largely Republican controlled. I don't think that's the entire answer.
I'm not suggesting that it's the entire answer, but I am suggesting that that it is, for instance, and the Koch brothers figured this out pretty quick. That's why ALEC exists. It is much easier to purchase and control state legislatures and governors' mansions than it is to purchase the entire federal government and the presidency. They can.
No, I'm with you on that.
It is much easier for the Koch brothers to maintain a hold on on individual state governments. We are watching that transformation take place even as we speak here in West Virginia. A majority of West Virginians do not want to see right-to-work legislation passed.
No, exactly.
But it's going to get passed because
there were thousands of people in the legislature when they passed it, and they just totally ignored the fact that they were even there.
Okay, as an outsider, let me ask you, the two of you then, because you're both West Virginians. Where was the majority of people when it came time to elect these Republican, state legislators?
They didn't vote.
Well, they either didn't vote or they ran. They ran to the polling place because they had been told that that one in their White House and his EPA was a killing the coal industry. And that's the question I ask, and I kind of get some sideward looks sometimes about it when I say, hey, look, all those UMWA members that were in the gallery there against right to work, where were who were they voting for? I understand secret ballot, but I have a suspicion, and at this point that's really all it can be,
that many of them voted for guns and coal
and God, all of which were proudly propounded by the right wingers who knew that the minute that they took office, the first thing they were going to do is they were going to fix those good old boys in the Union.
Yep.
Disagree, Bill?
No, I don't. I agree with you, Bob. I wanted to go to go back to the idea of returning control of the senators to the states. And Bob, you mentioned the fact that it's much easier to buy control of a state legislature than it is to buy the entire federal government. But the fact of the matter is, these states right now are under their control. And so what that means is with that in the House, it's gerrymandered districts that make it impossible or extremely difficult to dislodge these people. In the Senate, it's a statewide thing. So there's always the possibility, since there's no way to control your permanent control of the state Senate with gerrymandering, because the whole state votes. What you can do is you can ensure your control of it by giving control to the state legislature, which you most likely will continue to control. And so you make it impossible for the state to organize against the particular senators that you want. You're taking that out of the hands of the people, who at some point in time are going to wake up and try to resist this stuff. By the time they do, I don't believe the way to do it is going to be available to them. That's what bothers me. It's like when you look at the gerrymandering situation in the legislative districts right now, how many states are real in terms of control of state legislatures? How many states are really at play? Most of these people are in districts where they can't be dislodged. I mean, they're in safe districts. And so the revolution that Bernie Sanders is talking about that has to happen, it's unfortunately, I don't believe it can happen, because there aren't enough open districts.
But the thing is, Bill, and I'm not disagreeing with you, I think Senator Sanders is more than sanguine of the fact that this, if it's not already too late, we are rapidly approaching a last chance.
Right. I think you're right. I think that this election and Bernie Sanders' role in it is critical, because after this, there's not going to be another possibility of a Bernie Sanders even being a remote possibility.
I feel the same way about that, and I've been thinking, like, actually since he first announced, or was even considering announcing about a year ago, it occurred to me that this election, this primary even, kind of represents the last chance we have. Is it actually possible for the public will to beat the money? And that's really the contest that we're watching right now. And if we can't, if public sentiment cannot beat the money, then we're going to have a good candidate with Hillary Clinton. And if it's still possible, this is, like you said, this is our last chance. This is really what we're left with. And I was going to say, to elaborate on Bob's point about the revolution that Sanders represents, this is one thing that I think that Sanders has not articulated as well. I think I understand what he means, but he's really not gone out and articulated this revolution as well as I think he needs to have done, which is, I think what he's talking about is the people have got to get on the phones, and they've got to create pressure. It's not enough just to vote, but they've got to be a force. If you're going to represent government, if you're going to have an office, if you're going to be a representative or a senator, the only chance that we have at this point is even beyond the elections, because, we can't change gerrymandering, not overnight. We can't change money, not overnight. We can't do these things. But what we can do is we can certainly make, elected life miserable for the people that are there in office, and to push them. And I think that's what he's calling for. But I wish he could be a little clearer.
No, he's not said. You're right. He's not said that. And I think you're right. I think under the circumstances, that's the only chance. He made a comment I was watching a news report from a presentation that he gave. I can't remember what. I could have been in California, but I don't know. I don't know where it was. But anyway, he made the point at the very end about when he was basically addressing what is really the issue in this campaign, and it's basically whether big money will have all the power, or whether the people are going to be able to get a piece of it, not take power from money. That's not what he's talking. He's not asking for a revolution in that sense. All he's talking about is you can't have it all. And what he's talking about is that this election basically is about whether the people are going to have any, not just the majority power, any power. And I think in that sense, it's more, and I think he really ought to push that, because he's not pushing for the whole idea of a takeover by the people, a revolution in that sense. He's talking about somehow ensuring that the people will at least get a piece of the power, and it will
just
not
like
totally
Locke, what you were saying, like what Locke said, if you're below a certain level in poverty, you have a right to expect, to demand,
right.
know?
Right.
You know,
yeah,
the balance cannot go too far out of whack.
No, it's not 100% one way or 100% of the other. There is a middle.
You could actually, you know, in that light, you could cast the Sanders campaign as an appeal to Lockean principles, and wouldn't that make heads explode on the right?
He's basically campaigning for moderation. I mean, this whole idea of him being a democratic socialist or a social democrat, or whatever the hell you want to call it. The fact of the matter is, what he's arguing for is not that the needle goes all the way from one end all the way over to the other. He's saying we'll take just somewhere in the middle. All we want is access to a little bit of it,
right?
And they don't have a right to all of it. And people, I think if he made that point and emphasized the middle idea, the moderate idea, I think he might basically be able to attract some people.
Yeah, as odd as it sounds, I actually feel like he's still giving people too much credit for understanding where he's coming from already. That's the one big mistake I think he's making. I think he really needs to really spell these things out in much more basic terms, because you know it's so easy to run away with the label of socialist or whatever.
The revolution, the point you make, Horst, is I think an excellent one, because the revolution he's talking about is the idea that once the election's over, the people don't go back to their regular lives and leave all the decisions to the people they elected.
No, that's important. That's probably the most important thing of all.
What he's talking about is we need to keep the pressure on these guys in order to make them acknowledge our existence and recognize the fact that we have a right to some say in what they do. They don't have a blank check to do anything they want.
And he has at his fingertips. He could make an appeal to everyone's recent history. You know, when the public overwhelmingly elected Barack Obama in 2008, we voted for change. And then what happened? People said, "Okay, we got our change. We're going to go back to normal life." And he could really be punching that. And so far, well, I don't know. I guess he's got different priorities, you know, as he's going through the primary. But you know, there's a couple of things I wish he would state a little bit more clearly. But I tell you what, Dr. Bill, we're coming up on about 3 or 4 minutes to the top of the hour.
Right.
I'm going to bow out and let you guys get back to it, and I will look forward to our next opportunity to talk to each other.
I appreciate you so much, Horst. Thank you.
Yeah, I've had a great time.
It was great. It was
Bob,
great.
also, thanks to you, too.
No, thank you, Horst, for participating, man. These are always great conversations.
They really are.
Oh, for sure.
They're really great.
Yeah, well, I'm just happy to be part of it. So,
well, thank you, buddy. I appreciate it so much. At some point in my life, I want to meet that man.
Oh,
all right.
That's the great ambition out of more than 10 years of this effort, Dr. Bill.
Yeah.
Is to meet some of the amazing people that we get to talk with.
I know.
And I've gotten to meet a few, but not nearly enough.
No, I agree with you, Bob. Boy, this was a great conversation. I want to thank you, because you're the one that mentioned yesterday that we needed to do this. And I know part of it is because the issue's so topical on your program, as well it should be.
Well, I in turn wanted to make sure that I extended my thanks to you for letting me hijack what would otherwise be the schedule of your program. I know there was stuff you were working on, and it's a fascinating topic. But this, not just because it's arisen on my program, but because it seems to be something that is salient to an ongoing and very important debate within this country. I wanted to expressly thank you, Dr. Bill, because there's not, you're the only you there is. I mean, granted, there are other people out there that are deemed the smartest man on the internet, or the smartest man in radio. Well, you're not going to get that. You're not going to get what you do anywhere but with you. Mm-hmm. And it's what makes what you do so important, so vital, and not only interesting and not only educational, but in a way, I mean, it taken to heart, this stuff changes the way that one looks at one's everyday life and the way that one looks at one's community and one's country.
I appreciate that, Bob. I got a thing on Facebook one time about, it was a pronouncement by Robert Reich on this idea of an Article 5 convention, and the person who put the link on the Facebook page, and I can't remember who it was.
I think it was Carol.
It could have been Carol. I think it was Carol Baker.
Yes,
I think it was. And the issue was that when Robert Reich gets on it, it's an issue.
Yeah,
and it's taken a long time because this was an issue well over a year ago, and if not longer than that. I really, but again, a year ago you were basically whistling at ghosts, but now it's so close that it's not far-fetched anymore. It's very, very real. So, anyway, I appreciate you guys so much, and it's been an exhilarating hour for me, and I appreciate it. Bob, we're at the end. I'm gonna have to say goodbye.
Yes, indeed, and have a wonderful week.
I will.
And I look forward to our next conversation come next Monday.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate it so much. And you, the listeners, thank you so very much for being with us. Have a wonderful rest of the week and a wonderful weekend. In the eastern part of the country, we're looking at a pretty good weekend and a return to some warmer weather. But that's not the point. Be safe and really be good to each other, because I think that's important. This is Bill O'Brien. I'll be back with you again on next Monday, same time, same place. Thank you so very much. Be safe.